Israel, 1972. Part 1. The Storm's Wrath. The Negev Desert stretched like a boundless sea of sand and rock, its harsh landscape both mesmerizing and menacing. The relentless sun, high in the sky, bore down on everything below, casting long, wavering shadows over the dunes. It was late afternoon, and the air felt thick with heat, pressing down on the group of 6 archaeologists who had ventured deep into the desert. Their expedition had started with excitement, their minds filled with visions of uncovering ancient artifacts and unlocking secrets long buried beneath the sands. Now, after days in the unforgiving terrain, the excitement had been replaced by fatigue, and the weight of the desert's vastness was beginning to sink in. David, a 24-year-old archaeology student, walked near the back of the group, his eyes scanning the horizon. Tall and lean, with dark, windswept hair, David had a calm demeanor that often set him apart from his more outspoken colleagues. His love for history and the mysteries of the ancient world had driven him to join this expedition, but there was another part of him, quieter and more personal, that had come along on this journey: his faith. David had always been a man of quiet belief. He carried his Bible with him wherever he went, a constant reminder of the strength he found in his relationship with God. Yet he seldom spoke of his faith to others, not out of fear or shame, but because it was something deeply personal, something that guided him from within. The leader of the expedition, Dr. Isaac Cohen, walked at the front of the group, his weathered face turned to the horizon. A seasoned archaeologist in his 50s, Dr. Cohen had a reputation for his brilliant mind and relentless pursuit of historical truth. He had gathered this team of experts to search for remnants of ancient Israelite civilization, hoping to uncover evidence that could rewrite history books. But the desert, vast and indifferent, had begun to wear even on him. "How much further, Dr. Cohen?" Sarah called out, wiping sweat from her brow. She was a historian, young and full of ambition, but the harsh environment had taken its toll. Her voice was edged with exhaustion, and the weight of the journey showed in her eyes. Dr. Cohen didn't respond immediately. He pulled out his map, squinting at it as if the answer might be hidden in the creases of the worn paper. "A few more miles, perhaps," he muttered, though his tone lacked the confidence it once had. The group trudged on, the rhythm of their footsteps the only sound in the vast emptiness around them. The wind, once a gentle breeze, began to pick up, stirring the sand at their feet. David felt at first a shift in the air, a subtle change that set his instincts on edge. He looked up at the sky, noticing the sun's light growing dimmer, the horizon blurred by a strange haze. "Do you feel that?" Ethan, one of the younger archaeologists, asked, his voice tinged with nervousness. He was shorter than David, with a stocky build and a constant energy that now seemed to be fading. "Yeah," David replied, his brow furrowing. "Something's coming." As if on cue, the wind intensified, howling across the dunes, whipping the sand into swirling clouds. Within minutes, the calm desert transformed into a churning chaos of wind and grit. The sky darkened, and the sun vanished behind a wall of swirling dust. The sandstorm was upon them. "Everyone, stay close," Dr. Cohen shouted, his voice barely audible over the roaring wind. "Find cover." But there was no cover. The desert offered nothing but miles of open sand. The group scrambled to stay together, their faces wrapped in scarves, their eyes squinting against the onslaught of sand. David could barely see a few feet in front of him, the storm reducing their world to a suffocating blur of beige and brown. Sand stung his skin, found its way into his mouth and nose, making it difficult to breathe. Panic began to spread. Sarah tripped and fell, letting out a sharp cry. David rushed to her side, helping her to her feet as she struggled to regain her footing in the shifting sand. "Stay with me," David shouted, his voice nearly drowned out by the storm. He could see the others in the distance, their forms barely visible through the swirling sand. Dr. Cohen was waving his arms, trying to guide them, but the storm was relentless, pulling them apart with every gust. Minutes felt like hours as they fought against the storm. The world around them became a nightmare of sand and wind, the desert itself seemingly trying to consume them. David's heart raced, not just from the physical strain, but from the growing fear that they were losing each other. His mind raced, and despite the chaos, a singular thought formed in his head, a prayer. It was instinctive, almost unconscious, but as the storm raged, David began to whisper under his breath, "God, help us. Guide us through this." The words were quiet, lost in the storm, but they brought David a sense of calm. His faith had always been his anchor, and in this moment of chaos, it was the only thing that made sense. He couldn't see a way out of the storm, but he trusted that there was one. Suddenly, a sharp gust of wind knocked David off his feet. He tumbled into the sand, disoriented, his vision filled with the endless swirl of dust. He heard shouts, voices calling out in the storm, but he couldn't tell where they were coming from. The group was scattering, each member trying to find their own way through the storm. David pushed himself up, his limbs heavy with exhaustion. He could barely see in the thick fog of sand, but he pressed on, driven by the need to find his colleagues. He thought of Dr. Cohen, Sarah, Ethan, and the others. They had come here together, and they had to find a way out together. But the storm was too strong, and as the minutes dragged on, David realized the grim truth. They were lost. When the storm finally began to subside, the world around them was unrecognizable. The once clear sky was now a dull gray, and the landscape had changed, the dunes reshaped by the wind. David looked around, his heart sinking as he saw no sign of his colleagues. He was alone. Desperation clawed at him, but he forced it down, clinging to the only thing he had left, his faith. He closed his eyes and whispered another prayer, this time more fervent. "God, I don't know where they are, but I trust you. Please help me find them." The silence that followed felt heavy, but David remained still, waiting for a sign. Then, in the distance, he heard a faint voice, Ethan's voice, calling out through the still air. David's eyes snapped open, and he turned toward the sound. It was faint, but it was enough. He began to run, his feet sinking into the sand, his breath coming in ragged gasps. After what felt like an eternity, David found Ethan, half buried in the sand, coughing and gasping for air. Relief flooded through David as he knelt beside him, helping him to sit up. "We need to find the others," David said, his voice firm despite the exhaustion in his bones. Ethan nodded weakly, his face pale and streaked with sand. Together, they rose, scanning the horizon for any sign of their colleagues. Part 2. Desperation in the Dunes. As the storm faded into the distance, leaving only the quiet whisper of wind in its wake, the desert stretched out once again like a silent, indifferent sea. But now, the group of archaeologists who had once ventured into this barren land with such optimism found themselves scattered, broken, and shaken. The twilight sky above the Negev Desert began to darken, casting deep shadows across the dunes, and with it came the biting chill of nightfall. David and Ethan, after reuniting, had managed to stumble upon the remnants of their camp. It wasn't much, a few scattered bags half buried in the sand, a torn tent flapping weakly in the wind, but it was a small victory in the face of their ordeal. Exhausted and covered in sand, the two men slumped against a rock, their breaths ragged, their muscles aching from the struggle against the storm. The silence between them was thick, heavy with the weight of what had just transpired. "I thought we were done for," Ethan finally muttered, his voice raw with exhaustion and disbelief. His eyes, usually bright with youthful energy, now carried a haunted look, as if the storm had stripped away the last vestiges of his bravado. David didn't respond immediately. His gaze was fixed on the horizon, where the last rays of sunlight were slowly giving way to the deep purples and blues of night. His mind was racing, not just from the physical ordeal, but from the realization of how close they had come to losing everything. The desert was unforgiving, and they were far from civilization. Supplies were limited, and their water, what little remained, would not last long. "I thought the same," David finally said, his voice soft but steady. He looked at Ethan, his expression calm, though inside, he felt the same gnawing fear. "But we're still here. That's something." Ethan nodded weakly, but the uncertainty in his eyes spoke volumes. The storm had rattled him, and David could see that it was more than just physical exhaustion. It was a mental and emotional toll that would be hard to shake. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the temperature dropped sharply. What had been an oppressive heat just hours ago was now replaced by a bone-chilling cold that seeped through their clothes and into their skin. David could see his breath in the air, and he pulled his jacket tighter around him, though it offered little warmth. "Where are the others?" Ethan asked after a long silence. His voice cracked slightly, betraying the fear he had been trying to suppress. David didn't have an answer. He glanced around the camp, scanning the shifting sands for any sign of their colleagues. Dr. Cohen, Sarah, and the others had disappeared in the chaos of the storm, and now, as the desert settled into the stillness of night, their absence felt like a gaping void. "They'll find their way back," David said, though the uncertainty in his own voice was undeniable. He wanted to believe it, wanted to hold on to the hope that the rest of the group was out there, alive, and trying to find their way back to camp. But the truth was far more terrifying. The desert was vast, and without landmarks or a clear path, the others could be miles away, lost in the sea of sand. The two men sat in silence for a while longer, the cold pressing in around them. Above, the sky darkened further, and the first stars began to twinkle faintly, like distant beacons in the infinite night. David watched them, his thoughts drifting back to his faith. He had always believed that God was with him, guiding him through life's trials. But here, in the middle of the desert, with the weight of uncertainty pressing down on him, even his faith felt fragile. A soft rustle in the sand broke the silence. Both men tensed, their eyes darting toward the sound. Out of the darkness, a figure emerged, Sarah, stumbling toward them, her face pale and streaked with dirt. She collapsed to her knees as soon as she reached the camp, her breath coming in short, labored gasps. David rushed to her side, helping her to sit up. "Sarah, are you okay? What happened?" She shook her head, her eyes wide with fear. I don't know. I lost sight of everyone in the storm. I thought I was going to die out there." Her voice trembled as she spoke, the raw emotion evident in every word. "You're safe now," David said softly, though the words felt hollow in the face of their dire circumstances. Safe was a relative term, and in the middle of the desert, safety was as fleeting as the sand that shifted beneath their feet. Ethan handed Sarah a small canteen of water, one of the few supplies they had left. She drank greedily, her body desperate for hydration, though David could see the grim reality in Ethan's eyes. They didn't have enough water to last much longer, especially if the others didn't return soon. Night descended fully now, blanketing the desert in darkness. The stars above seemed brighter, more vivid, but they offered little comfort. The wind had died down, leaving the desert in an eerie, almost oppressive silence. David, Ethan, and Sarah huddled together, their backs against the rock that shielded them from the wind, though the cold still gnawed at their bones. "We need to make a plan," Sarah said, her voice steadier now, though still tinged with anxiety. "We can't just sit here and wait. We need to find the others, find water, find a way out of this." David nodded. "You're right, but we can't do anything in the dark. When the sun rises, we'll figure out our next move." They sat in silence for a few more minutes, each lost in their own thoughts. The enormity of their situation weighed heavily on them all. The desert stretched out in every direction, an endless expanse of sand and rock, and somewhere out there, their colleagues were either lost or worse. Ethan broke the silence, his voice low and tense. "What if they don't come back? What if we're all that's left?" The question hung in the air, unanswered. It was a possibility they all feared but hadn't voiced until now. The desert was vast and unforgiving, and the storm had scattered them like grains of sand. There was no guarantee that the others were still alive, and the thought sent a chill through David that had nothing to do with the cold. "We can't think like that," David said. though even he knew how fragile their hope was. "We have to believe they'll make it back." Ethan didn't respond, but the doubt in his eyes was clear. It was a doubt that was beginning to creep into all of them, no matter how much they tried to fight it. As the hours dragged on, exhaustion took hold, and despite the cold and fear, they began to drift off into a fitful sleep, huddled together for warmth. The night was long, and the desert was silent, save for the occasional whisper of wind through the dunes. David's sleep was restless, his dreams filled with visions of sandstorms, endless deserts, and the faces of his missing colleagues. He awoke several times throughout the night, jolted awake by the cold or the weight of their situation pressing down on him. Each time he opened his eyes, he stared up at the vast, star-filled sky, feeling both incredibly small and incredibly alone. In the distance, the first faint glow of dawn began to creep over the horizon, painting the sky in soft hues of pink and orange. The air was still, and the desert, for all its desolation, seemed almost peaceful in the early morning light. But the peace was fleeting. As the first rays of sunlight touched the sand, David knew that the real challenge was just beginning. Part 3. The Prayer of Faith. The night was deep and silent, with only the distant howling of the wind echoing through the desert. The cold bit into their bones, sharper and more relentless than any of them had anticipated. David sat by the dying embers of their small campfire, his arms wrapped tightly around his knees as he watched the last flickers of warmth fade into the night. The others had fallen into an uneasy sleep, huddled together for warmth, but sleep had eluded David. His mind was too full, too overwhelmed by the events of the day, by the uncertainty of what awaited them in the morning. The stars overhead, once a source of awe and wonder, now felt like distant, indifferent witnesses to their struggle. The vastness of the desert stretched out endlessly in every direction, and with it, the weight of isolation pressed down on him. It was a suffocating feeling, as though the desert itself was alive, watching them, testing their resolve. David had never felt so small, so vulnerable as he did in that moment. He glanced over at Sarah and Ethan, their faces barely visible in the faint light of the fire. They were exhausted, physically and emotionally drained, and David knew that their spirits were fragile. The fear was palpable, lurking just beneath the surface of their stoic expressions. It was only a matter of time before that fear took over, before despair set in and crushed what little hope they had left. David's thoughts drifted to the others, Dr. Cohen and the rest of the team. They were still out there somewhere in the desert, lost and alone. The guilt gnawed at him, a constant ache in his chest. He had come on this expedition with the hope of discovering something ancient, something meaningful, but now it all seemed so far away, so insignificant in the face of survival. As he stared into the fire, his mind racing, David felt a tug deep within him. It was a familiar feeling, one he had known for years but had often kept to himself. It was his faith, that quiet, steady presence that had always guided him, even in the most difficult of times. He had prayed earlier, during the storm, but now, in the stillness of the night, that feeling grew stronger, more insistent. It wasn't just a quiet call, it was a desperate need. He stood up slowly, his legs stiff from the cold, and walked a few paces away from the camp, careful not to disturb the others. The night air was frigid, each breath turning to mist as it left his lips. The silence was overwhelming, broken only by the faint rustling of sand carried by the wind. David's heart pounded in his chest, not from fear, but from the weight of what he was about to do. He looked up at the sky, the vast expanse of stars stretching out above him, and took a deep breath. His throat felt tight, his mind racing with 100 different thoughts, but he forced himself to focus. This wasn't about him. It was about something greater. It was about survival, about the lives of his friends, about trusting in something beyond what he could see. David dropped to his knees in the sand, bowing his head. The cold seeped through his clothes, biting at his skin, but he didn't move. He closed his eyes, the darkness behind his eyelids matching the black void of the desert around him, and began to pray. At first, his voice was barely a whisper, a soft murmur lost in the wind, But as the words came, they grew stronger, filled with an urgency he hadn't expected. "God, we need you now," he began, his voice steady despite the tremor in his hands. "We are lost. We are afraid. And we don't know what to do. But I know you are here. I know you can hear me. Please show us the way. Give us a sign, something to hold on to. We are desperate, Lord, and we have nothing left but our faith." The words poured out of him, unfiltered, raw and honest. David had prayed many times in his life, but never like this. There was a weight to his prayer, a gravity that felt different, deeper. He wasn't just asking for help. He was pleading for it, laying his heart bare before the heavens. The vulnerability of it all struck him, but there was no room for pride or hesitation. Not here, not now. His breath came in short, visible puffs as the cold gnawed at his skin, but he pressed on, his voice growing louder with each passing moment. "We are small, God, and this desert is vast. We don't know where to turn, but I trust that you do. I trust that you can see what we cannot. I don't know why you've brought us here, but I believe there's a reason. Please, show us your mercy. Show us a way out." David's voice cracked, and for a moment, he faltered, the weight of the situation threatening to overwhelm him. But he gritted his teeth, refusing to give in to the fear, the doubt. He had come this far. He couldn't stop now. "Please, Lord, give us water. Give us strength. Give us hope. Show us that you are here, in this desert, with us. We cannot do this alone." The silence that followed was deafening. David remained on his knees, his hands clasped tightly together, his head bowed. The wind had stilled, as if the entire desert was holding its breath, waiting for a response. The stars above twinkled, cold and distant, offering no sign, no reassurance. For a long, agonizing moment, there was nothing but the sound of his own breathing, the faint rustling of the sand, and the cold, oppressive stillness of the night. David opened his eyes slowly, his heart sinking. Had his prayer fallen on deaf ears? He had asked, pleaded, but the desert remained silent, indifferent. The doubt crept in, insidious and cruel, whispering in the back of his mind that maybe there was no answer, no miracle waiting to save them. Maybe they were truly alone. But even as the doubt took hold, David refused to give in. He stood slowly, his legs trembling from the cold and exhaustion, but his resolve was steady. Faith wasn't about seeing, it was about believing. Even in the face of silence, even when the answer wasn't immediate, David knew that his prayer had been heard. He had to believe it. He walked back to the camp, his steps slow and deliberate, his heart still heavy, but filled with a quiet determination. As he reached the others, he glanced at their sleeping forms, each one curled up in the sand, unaware of the silent plea that had just been made on their behalf. He didn't wake them. Instead, he sat down by the fire once more, his eyes fixed on the horizon where the first hint of dawn was just beginning to touch the sky. It wasn't much, just a faint glow of light in the distance, but it was enough. David pulled his jacket tighter around him and leaned back against the rock, his eyes heavy with exhaustion, but his mind still alert. He didn't know what the morning would bring, but for now, the darkness had passed, and with it, a sliver of hope remained. As the sky began to lighten, the desert slowly stirred to life. The air was still cold, the sand beneath them frigid, but the promise of a new day hung in the air. David closed his eyes, whispering one final prayer before sleep finally claimed him. "Thank you, Lord. Whatever happens, I trust you." Part 4. A Miracle in the Desert. The first light of dawn crept over the horizon, casting a faint, golden glow across the desert. The chill of the night had not yet lifted, and the cold air clung to the dunes, making every breath feel sharp and biting. David stirred from his restless sleep, the faint warmth of the rising sun coaxing him awake. His body ached from the long hours spent in the cold, and as he sat up, he winced, feeling the stiffness in his muscles. His mind was still foggy with the remnants of exhaustion, but there was a sense of urgency pulling him out of his weariness. He glanced around the camp, seeing that Sarah and Ethan were still asleep, huddled together for warmth. Their faces were pale, their bodies curled tightly against the cold. The fire had long since died, leaving only a few faintly glowing embers in its wake. The stillness of the desert was palpable, a heavy silence that seemed to hang in the air, as if the world itself was waiting for something to happen. David rubbed his eyes, his thoughts drifting back to the prayer he had whispered under the vast night sky. It had been a moment of desperation, a plea for help when all seemed lost. But now, in the cold light of dawn, the doubts crept in once more. Had his words fallen on deaf ears? Was there really any hope of salvation in this unforgiving wasteland? As he rose to his feet, his breath visible in the cold morning air, David looked out across the dunes. The desert seemed endless, stretching out in every direction, its vast expanse both beautiful and terrifying. There was no sign of life, no movement, only the wind gently stirring the sand. The enormity of it all hit him again, the crushing realization that they were still lost, still stranded in this desolate place. He took a deep breath, trying to steady himself. "Faith," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "It's about faith." Just then, a faint sound broke through the silence, a low rumble, almost imperceptible at first, but growing louder with each passing moment. David's heart skipped a beat as he turned toward the source of the noise. In the distance, the horizon was shifting, a strange movement that caught his eye. At first, he thought it was another sandstorm, but there was something different about it, something almost deliberate. He squinted, straining to see through the haze of the early morning light. And then he saw it. A cloud, dark and heavy, was forming in the distance, rolling toward them with a speed that defied explanation. It moved like a living thing, a force of nature that seemed to have a purpose. David's pulse quickened as he watched the cloud draw closer, a strange mix of fear and hope surging through him. "Ethan, Sarah," David called out, his voice hoarse but urgent. Sarah stirred first, her face scrunched in confusion as she rubbed her eyes. "What is it?" she mumbled, still half asleep. "Look!" David pointed to the horizon, his voice trembling with both excitement and disbelief. "Do you see that?" Ethan sat up quickly, blinking as he followed David's gaze. His face twisted into a frown, unsure of what he was seeing. "Well, what is that?" Sarah stood up, now fully awake, her eyes widening as the cloud continued its rapid approach. "Is that rain?" David's heart pounded in his chest. Could it be? The desert was known for its extreme dryness. Rain was a rare event, and yet here it was, barreling toward them like a gift from the heavens. He felt a surge of energy, a sense of awe and disbelief all at once. Was this the answer to his prayer? Could this truly be happening? The three of them stood in stunned silence as the cloud rolled over the dunes, growing larger and darker with each passing moment. The wind picked up, carrying with it the unmistakable scent of rain. Cool, refreshing, life-giving rain. The air crackled with anticipation, as if the desert itself was holding its breath, waiting for the inevitable downpour. And then, with a sudden roar, the sky opened up. The first drops of rain fell slowly at first, soft and tentative, as though testing the parched earth. But within moments, the rain intensified, transforming into a steady downpour that soaked the sand, turning the once dry and lifeless desert into a living, breathing landscape. The rain splattered against their faces, cool and refreshing, and David let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. It's rain," Sarah whispered, her voice filled with wonder. David laughed, a deep, joyous sound that bubbled up from somewhere deep inside him. He threw his head back, letting the rain wash over him, soaking his clothes and his skin, drenching him in a way that felt like pure relief. For a moment, he felt weightless, as if the burden of their situation had been lifted by this miraculous storm. It wasn't just rain, it was hope. It was life. Ethan joined in the laughter, his arms outstretched as he spun in the rain, his face lit up with a childlike joy. "This is impossible. It shouldn't be raining here, not like this." But David knew better. This wasn't just a random storm. It was an answer. It was the miracle they had prayed for. His faith, which had been tested to its limits, now surged within him, stronger than ever before. As the rain continued to pour down, something remarkable happened. The ground beneath their feet, once dry and cracked, began to shift. The sand gave way to something solid, something ancient and hidden beneath the surface. A small stream of water began to flow from a nearby dune, trickling down the slope and pooling at their feet. "Look at that," Sarah gasped, pointing to the stream. "Where did that come from?" David's heart swelled with awe as he knelt by the stream, dipping his hand into the cool, clear water. It was real, more real than anything he could have imagined. He lifted his hand to his lips, tasting the fresh water, and felt a sense of profound gratitude wash over him. This was no ordinary rain. This was divine intervention. "It's a hidden spring," David said, his voice thick with emotion. The rain must have revealed it. The three of them gathered around the spring, drinking deeply from the life-giving water. It tasted sweet, pure, as if it had been waiting beneath the surface of the desert all along, just waiting for the right moment to emerge. As the rain continued to fall, the desert around them began to transform. What had once been a barren, lifeless landscape was now teeming with new possibilities. The sand, once dry and unforgiving, soaked up the water eagerly, giving way to patches of green. Small plants, long dormant beneath the surface, began to sprout, their vibrant green leaves pushing through the wet sand. David stood up, his clothes soaked, his face glistening with rain and tears of joy. He looked out across the transformed landscape, his heart overflowing with gratitude and awe. The rain had answered more than just their immediate need for water. It had brought life to the desert, just as his prayer had brought hope to their hearts. "This isn't just rain," David said, his voice filled with conviction. "This is a miracle." Sarah nodded, her eyes wide with amazement. "I never would have believed it if I hadn't seen it with my own eyes." Ethan wiped the rain from his face, his usual skepticism replaced by a deep sense of wonder. "I don't know how to explain this, but I think you're right, David. This is something greater than us." David smiled. The weight of their journey now lifted from his shoulders. The desert had tested them, pushed them to their limits, but it had also revealed something extraordinary. In their moment of deepest despair, they had been given a gift, one that defied explanation, but that spoke to the power of faith, of hope, and of the belief that even in the darkest moments, there was light. As the rain began to taper off, the desert fell into a peaceful stillness once more. The stream continued to flow, and the hidden spring bubbled up from beneath the sand, a constant reminder of the miracle that had saved them. David felt a deep sense of peace settle over him, a certainty that they would survive, that they had been guided through the storm by a force far greater than themselves. The desert, once a place of desolation and fear, now felt like sacred ground, a place where the impossible had become possible, where faith had turned despair into hope. Part 5. Faith Revealed. The rain had stopped, leaving behind an unexpected transformation, a desert reborn. The once barren landscape now held an ethereal beauty. The sun was beginning its slow ascent over the horizon, casting warm golden rays that danced across the wet sand. The air, which had been dry and harsh for so long, now carried a cool, refreshing scent of moisture mixed with the earthy fragrance of newly dampened ground. In the heart of this miraculous scene stood David, Sarah, and Ethan, their clothes still damp from the downpour, their faces marked by wonder. David stood by the edge of the small spring that had appeared where the desert had once been lifeless. The water trickled softly, a gentle sound that seemed like a song in the silence of the early morning. He knelt down, his fingers tracing the edge of the spring, marveling at the way the earth had opened itself to reveal this hidden source of life. He had never seen anything like it, a gift, a sign, an answer. The desert, which had threatened to take their lives, had now offered them salvation. It wasn't just water, it was hope in its most tangible form. As David rose, wiping his damp hands on his trousers, he looked up at the sky, now painted in soft hues of pink and orange. He couldn't help but feel an overwhelming sense of gratitude. His prayer had been answered, not with words but with rain, life-giving and undeniable. Behind him, Sarah and Ethan were quietly talking, their voices low, as if they didn't want to break the sacred stillness of the moment. Sarah's eyes, still red from the tears of fear and exhaustion she had shed during the long night, were now bright with renewed energy. She kept looking at the spring, as if she couldn't quite believe it was real. "I don't know how to explain this," Sarah said, shaking her head. "This shouldn't be possible. There's no logical explanation for what's happening here." Ethan, who had always been the skeptic among them, was silent for a moment. His usual sharp-edged sarcasm was absent. Instead, there was a look of quiet awe on his face. "Maybe not everything has to be explained," he said finally. "Maybe some things just are." David approached them, his heart still pounding with the magnitude of what they had witnessed. He could see it in their faces, the questions, the disbelief, the sense of something larger than themselves. What had started as a simple archaeological expedition had turned into something far beyond what any of them could have imagined. "There's no doubt," David said softly, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "This was a miracle. It's not just the rain, not just the spring. It's everything. The timing, the way it all happened. This was an answer." Sarah bit her lip, her eyes welling with emotion. "I'm not sure I've ever really believed in miracles," she admitted, her voice trembling. "I've always been so focused on facts, on history, on what I can see and touch. But this makes me wonder." David smiled gently. "Faith doesn't always make sense," he said. "It's not something you can measure or prove. It's something you feel, something that gives you strength when everything else fails." Ethan shook his head, still staring at the spring. "I never thought I'd say this, but after what we've been through, I can't deny it. I don't know what I believe anymore, but I know there's something more than what we can explain." The three of them stood in silence for a long moment, the weight of the experience settling in. The spring continued to flow, a gentle reminder of the miracle they had witnessed, and the desert around them seemed to hum with a quiet energy, as if the earth itself was alive with possibility. David's mind drifted back to the others, Dr. Cohen, the rest of the team. The storm had scattered them, and they still didn't know where they were, but now, with the spring and the rain, they had what they needed to survive. They had water, and they had hope, but the search for their lost colleagues wasn't over. "We need to find the others," David said finally, breaking the silence. His voice was calm but determined. "They're still out there, and we can't leave without them." Sarah nodded, her expression resolute. "You're right. We've survived, and now we need to make sure they do too." Ethan glanced at the spring one last time before turning to face David. "We can follow the water," he said, his voice thoughtful. "There might be other springs nearby, or maybe the rain has uncovered more resources. If we keep moving, we'll find them." David agreed, feeling a renewed sense of purpose. They couldn't stay here, as tempting as it was to rest by the spring and enjoy the miracle they had been given. There was more work to be done. The desert had tested them, had pushed them to their limits, but it had also shown them that even in the most desolate places, there was hope. As they packed up what little remained of their supplies, David felt a deep sense of peace settle over him. The fear, the doubt, the despair that had plagued him during the night had faded, replaced by a quiet certainty that they would make it through. His faith had been tested in ways he had never imagined, but it had also been strengthened. The three of them set off once more, leaving the spring behind, but carrying with them the knowledge that they were not alone. The desert, which had seemed so vast and unforgiving, now felt like a place of possibility, a place where miracles could happen. The sun was fully rising now, casting long shadows across the dunes, but instead of feeling lost in its immensity, David felt a sense of direction, of purpose. As they walked, the conversation turned to lighter topics, memories of home, favorite foods, plans for the future. There was laughter, real laughter, the kind that had been absent for so long. It felt good to smile again, to feel the weight of fear lifting with each step they took. But the miracle wasn't finished yet. As they reached the top of a large dune, a breathtaking sight greeted them. Below, in a shallow valley, was an oasis, a real, vibrant oasis, with lush greenery and a shimmering pool of water that seemed impossibly beautiful against the backdrop of the desert. Palm trees swayed gently in the breeze, and birds, real birds, flitted between the branches, their songs carrying across the still air. Sarah gasped, covering her mouth with her hands. I can't believe it. Is this real? Ethan let out a low whistle, shaking his head in disbelief. I don't know what's real anymore, he said, laughing softly. But I'll take it. David stood in awe, his heart swelling with gratitude. The spring had been a miracle, but this was something beyond even his wildest dreams. An oasis right when they needed it most. It wasn't just an answer to their immediate needs. It was a symbol of something far greater. This is more than just luck, David said quietly, his voice filled with reverence. We were meant to find this. They descended into the valley, their steps light with anticipation. As they reached the edge of the oasis, they dropped to their knees, dipping their hands into the cool, clear water. It tasted like life itself, sweet and refreshing, a gift that couldn't be explained away by logic or chance. For a long time, they stayed by the water, drinking, laughing, and marveling at the oasis. It felt like a dream, a place so beautiful and perfect that it defied explanation. But David knew it was real. It was the culmination of everything they had been through, a reminder that faith wasn't about what you could see. It was about believing in something greater than yourself, something that could guide you even in the darkest moments. As they rested in the shade of the palm trees, David closed his eyes, feeling the peace of the oasis settle over him. He had prayed in the darkness, and now, in the light of day, he saw the answer. It wasn't just the water, the spring, or the oasis. It was the journey itself, the way they had been tested and found strength in each other, in their faith, and in the belief that even in the most desolate places, miracles were possible. And as the sun rose higher in the sky, casting its warm light over the desert, David smiled, knowing that they were no longer lost. They had found their way, guided by faith, hope, and a prayer whispered in the heart of the desert. If this story moved you, please leave a comment below to share your thoughts and experiences. Thank you so much for watching, and as always, God bless you.